Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, only to discover that everything familiar in your life has suddenly vanished. There is no house to shelter you from the rain or the cold, no electricity, no phone, no supermarket, no hospital, no police, no internet to provide answers in just a few seconds. All around you stretches an untamed wilderness reaching to the horizon. There are no roads leading home, because home does not yet exist in the way we understand it today. The birdsong you once considered peaceful suddenly becomes the signal of a forest filled with unknown dangers. A patch of grass rustling in the wind might simply be a breeze, or it could be a predator silently creeping closer. When the sun goes down, darkness no longer means a relaxing evening. It becomes the time when the eyes of countless animals can see you far more clearly than you can see them. How long would you survive? A single day? A week? Or perhaps only a few hours? The astonishing truth is that our ancestors did far more than merely survive in that world. They endured for tens of thousands of generations. They raised children, cared for the elderly, survived brutal winters, confronted dangerous predators, endured disease and starvation, and adapted to dramatic climate changes. Without modern technology, they accomplished something that many of us today would probably fail to do if we were suddenly transported back to prehistoric times. How did a species with no sharp claws, no long fangs, no exceptional speed, no overwhelming strength, and no thick fur to protect against the cold eventually become the dominant life form across almost the entire planet? The answer was never raw physical strength, nor was it simply fire, stone spears, or caves. The real secret lay in the extraordinary way the human brain learned to adapt, cooperate, remember, create, and pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Those seemingly ordinary abilities transformed a small, vulnerable primate into the ultimate survivor in one of the most dangerous worlds imaginable. So how did prehistoric humans truly survive? Let's explore this remarkable story piece by piece, drawing on archaeology, anthropology, cognitive science, and evolutionary biology to understand why our existence today is actually the result of hundreds of thousands of years of extraordinary adaptation. If we look at the human body objectively, it is difficult to believe that our ancestors once lived in a world filled with gigantic predators. We do not possess jaws powerful enough to crush bones like hyenas. We have no razor-sharp claws like bears. We cannot outrun horses, nor are we physically stronger than most predators in a direct confrontation. Our skin lacks the thick protective fur needed to withstand freezing temperatures, while our sense of smell and hearing are far inferior to those of many other animals. If nature were a competition based solely on physical ability, humans would have stood almost no chance. That is why many people naturally ask a fascinating question. If our ancestors were so physically weak, why didn't they become extinct almost immediately? Archaeological evidence suggests that the question itself may lead us to misunderstand our own past. Human beings never conquered nature through strength alone. We changed the rules of the game. Imagine a small group of prehistoric humans crossing the vast grasslands of the Ice Age. In the distance, a herd of enormous woolly mammoths grazes peacefully. Nearby, cave lions, giant hyenas, and ancient wolves watch every movement of their potential prey. A lone human would have almost no chance of surviving in such an environment. But humans rarely lived alone. Instead of relying on individual strength, they relied on the community. One person watched for footprints. Another listened carefully to sounds coming from the tall grass. Someone carried the fire. Others protected the children and the elderly. Each individual performed only a small part of the task, yet together they became an information processing system far more capable than any one member alone. Anthropologists propose that this was one of the greatest turning points in human evolution. Our brains did not evolve simply to think. They evolved to think together. The ability to share experience meant that every new generation no longer had to start from scratch. A child did not have to discover alone which berries were poisonous or which animals were dangerous. Those lessons had already been passed down through parents, grandparents, and the wider community, through words, gestures, observation, and imitation. It was an invisible form of technology, yet more valuable than any weapon. A lion must learn to hunt almost entirely from the beginning during its own lifetime. A human child, by contrast, is born into a vast library of knowledge accumulated over thousands of generations. This extraordinary capacity to accumulate knowledge gradually widened the gap between humans and every other animal on Earth. Yet knowledge alone was never enough. Knowing where food exists does not guarantee that you can obtain it. Knowing how to make fire will not help you survive the winter if there is nothing left to eat. So the next question becomes inevitable. Before supermarkets, farms, and reliable food supplies ever existed, how did our ancestors manage to find enough food every single day? When we think about prehistoric life, most of us immediately picture men charging toward a gigantic woolly mammoth with stone spears in hand. It is certainly a dramatic image, but it also gives us a misleading picture of our ancestors' everyday lives. Current research indicates that successful hunts were probably far less common than movies often portray. A single hunt could last for hours, or even days, and still end without any reward. Animals were faster, stronger, and just as familiar with the landscape as the people pursuing them. If an entire community had depended solely on meat, it would have struggled to survive for long. So what actually sustained human life most of the time? The answer probably did not lie in a single food source, but in an astonishing diversity of resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that our ancestors became masters at taking advantage of everything their environment had to offer. They gathered seasonal berries, dug up starchy roots and tubers, collected seeds, searched for wild honey, caught fish in shallow waters, harvested shellfish, gathered insects, and collected bird eggs. Every landscape offered its own unique menu, and humans learned to adapt themselves to each environment rather than trying to force nature to change. Interestingly, many of these food sources leave almost no obvious traces in the archaeological record. A bone can survive for tens of thousands of years. A basket filled with wild berries cannot. For that reason, researchers spent decades overestimating the importance of hunting alone. Only after the development of more advanced analytical techniques did a far more complete picture of prehistoric diets begin to emerge. That realization also reveals another surprising truth. Sometimes, humans were not the first predators to reach a carcass. They were the ones who arrived afterward. One possible explanation is that many ancient human groups carefully observed the behavior of large predators. After lions, leopards, or hyenas abandoned a carcass, humans quickly approached to recover whatever meat remained, especially the marrow inside the bones and the brain, two of the richest sources of fat and energy available. Today, the idea of scavenging animal carcasses may seem unappealing, but in a world where every calorie could determine whether you lived or died, it was an exceptionally intelligent strategy. A sharp stone tool could split open bones that many other scavengers were unable to break. That meant that even when humans arrived late, they could still obtain the most valuable nutrients. Food, therefore, was not simply something that was hunted. It was something that was discovered, observed, remembered, and shared. Perhaps the most important survival skill was never throwing a spear with perfect accuracy. It was knowing where to look long before hunger became desperate. Imagine an elder pointing toward a distant valley and explaining that the fruit trees there would ripen in 2 weeks, or that a particular stream always retained water even during the dry season. That was more than memory. It was a survival map stored inside the human mind. Over thousands of years, these invisible maps became increasingly detailed and increasingly accurate. They were passed from one generation to the next, allowing every child to inherit an understanding of the world instead of having to rediscover everything alone. Yet even with the knowledge of how to find food, another challenge remained. Human beings could not spend 24 hours a day hunting and gathering. When darkness fell, temperatures dropped rapidly, and predators became active. They needed somewhere safe enough to sleep. So before houses, villages, and fortified walls ever existed, where did our ancestors find safety? If Hollywood were your only source of information, you would probably believe that prehistoric humans spent their entire lives inside dark caves, sitting beside campfires with walls covered in ancient paintings. It is certainly an iconic image, but it does not tell the whole story. Archaeological evidence suggests that most of our ancestors did not live permanently in caves. In reality, many ancient groups moved continuously with the seasons, following migrating animals, reliable water sources, and the natural cycles of plants. A shelter was only useful as long as the surrounding environment could continue to support the entire community. Once the food disappeared, they moved on. That means that, for them, Home was never a fixed location. Home was wherever survival remained possible. A cave was simply one option among many. When they discovered a cave that was deep enough, dry enough, and easy to defend, it could become an ideal shelter against freezing winds, heavy rain, or harsh winters. Massive stone walls retained heat far better than open ground, while also providing natural protection from extreme weather. But caves came with dangers of their own. Humans were not the only species looking for shelter. Cave bears might already be hibernating inside the very cave a human group had just discovered. Hyenas often dragged carcasses into caves to feed. Cave lions also viewed enclosed spaces as safe resting places. In other words, every time prehistoric humans entered a new cave, they were not simply searching for shelter. They were stepping into the territory of other predators. That helps explain why archaeological sites frequently reveal alternating layers of human occupation and large carnivores inside the same caves over thousands of years. Sometimes humans occupied them. Sometimes the predators returned. That competition continued for millennia. It also explains why many communities chose to build shelters in the open instead of depending entirely on caves. Anthropologists propose that prehistoric people learned to construct simple but remarkably effective shelters using branches, wooden poles, the bones of large animals, animal hides, and dried grasses. In parts of Ice Age Europe, archaeologists have even uncovered the remains of structures built from mammoth bones, covered with animal skins to shield their occupants from icy winds. These were not houses by modern standards, but they were more than sufficient to retain warmth, block the wind, and protect children during long winter nights. Even more remarkable was the way humans selected their campsites. They did not choose locations randomly. An ideal campsite was close enough to fresh water but far enough from riverbanks to avoid sudden floods. It needed a wide field of view to detect predators from a distance, while also providing reliable escape routes if danger appeared. In other words, our ancestors had learned to read the landscape itself. A hillside was not simply a hillside. It was a lookout point. A line of trees was not merely shade. It was camouflage. A stream was not just a source of drinking water. It also attracted other animals. Inside their minds, every feature of the environment carried survival value. Today, we look at a forest and see beautiful scenery. They looked at the same forest and saw hundreds of life or death decisions that had to be made before nightfall. Yet no matter how carefully they chose their shelters, one enemy remained that no stone wall could ever keep away. Darkness. Darkness. When the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, the world seemed to belong to the countless eyes that could see effortlessly through the night. So what allowed a primate with relatively poor night vision to reclaim the advantage after sunset? The answer begins with one of the most important discoveries in human history: fire. Imagine a night without electricity. No streetlights, no lights glowing from the windows of distant buildings, no smartphone screens illuminating your face. Nothing but a sky overflowing with stars and a darkness so complete it is almost impossible for modern people to imagine. For us today, such a night might feel peaceful. For our ancestors, it was the most dangerous time of every day. During daylight, humans relied on their eyesight to detect footprints, read the landscape, and identify threats from a distance. But once the sun disappeared, that advantage almost vanished. Many predators became even more active precisely when humans were at their most vulnerable. That was when fire changed everything. Interestingly, fire itself was never a human invention. Lightning strikes, volcanic eruptions, and wildfires had been creating fire for millions of years before our ancestors ever appeared. The true achievement was not creating the first fire. It was learning how to keep it alive. Archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest human communities may have carried glowing embers home from naturally occurring fires. Maintaining an uninterrupted flame was probably even more important than knowing how to ignite a new one, because in cold or wet conditions, losing the fire meant losing countless survival advantages all at once. A tiny ember carefully buried beneath a layer of ash could continue glowing for many hours. Someone in the group always had the responsibility of watching over the fire. It was not merely another daily task. It was protecting the survival of the entire community. Yet warmth was only a small part of what fire provided. Fire did much more. Its light discouraged many predators from approaching. Its smoke drove away insects. Cooking meat greatly reduced the risk posed by many harmful microorganisms. Softer food also meant the body needed less energy to chew and digest it. Current research indicates that cooking may have allowed humans to extract significantly more energy from the same amount of food. That additional energy helped support the growth of the brain, the most energy-demanding organ in the human body, through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. If that is true, then fire did far more than transform dinner. It helped transform the human brain itself. But perhaps the greatest influence of fire was not biological. It was cultural. Imagine a group of people sitting together in a circle after a long day of hunting. Outside lies complete darkness. Inside, flames dance across every face. Perhaps this was where the very first stories were told. An elder pointed toward the stars and explained how to navigate. A mother taught her child how to recognize wolf tracks. A hunter described an encounter with a bear so others would avoid making the same mistake. Knowledge no longer existed only inside one person's mind. It began to be shared. Anthropologists propose that these evenings around the fire created the perfect conditions for language, collective memory, and culture to flourish. Once humans had extra hours to communicate after sunset, they exchanged more than practical information. They told stories about the past, imagined the future, and created narratives that strengthened the bonds holding the community together. Perhaps it was around those circles of firelight that the idea of we first became more important than I, that marked an extraordinary turning point. Because in the prehistoric world, even the smartest individual could still die. But a community that knew how to cooperate stood a far greater chance of surviving. Fire brought people physically closer together. Yet what truly kept them alive was not the fire itself. It was the relationships that formed around it. So if cooperation was the real key, what allowed humans to trust one another, share food, and protect the weakest members of their community instead of thinking only about their own survival? Imagine taking a modern human and sending them back to prehistoric times, forcing them to survive completely alone. The outcome would probably not be very different from what it was hundreds of thousands of years ago. They might know how to start a fire. They might understand the principles of hunting. They might even possess an enormous amount of scientific knowledge. But after only a few weeks, much of that knowledge would become almost useless if there were no one to share the work, care for injuries, or warn them when danger approached. It is a fascinating paradox. Human beings are often celebrated as the most intelligent species on Earth. Yet our greatest strength has never resided inside a single brain. It has always existed within many brains working together as one interconnected network. Current research indicates that Homo sapiens were not necessarily stronger or individually smarter than every other human species. What may have set them apart was their remarkable ability to build larger, more flexible, and more enduring social groups. Wolves hunt in packs. Lions do the same. But the scale of their cooperation is largely limited by instinct. Humans are different. We can cooperate with people who are not related to us. We can even cooperate with complete strangers. That is an exceptionally rare ability in the animal kingdom. Imagine a large communal hunt. Not everyone carries a spear. Some people track footprints. Others drive the herd toward a predetermined location. The elders study the landscape and make strategic decisions. The strongest young adults take on the greatest risks. Those who remain behind prepare shelter, care for the children, and keep the fire alive. No role is unnecessary. Every person contributes to the survival of the entire community. That was more than a division of labor. It was trust. You had to believe that if you shared your meat today, someone else would share theirs tomorrow. You had to believe that if you were injured during the hunt, someone would carry you home. You had to believe that if the worst happened, your children would still be protected by the community. Anthropologists propose that these relationships built upon trust created one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. A society willing to share risks was far more stable than one in which every individual pursued only immediate self-interest. This also helps explain why archaeologists sometimes discover the remains of individuals who suffered devastating injuries or were born with severe disabilities, yet continued living for many years afterward. A person who could no longer hunt, who could no longer walk, who could no longer defend themselves. And yet, they survived. That could have happened only because someone else cared for them. It is one of the quietest yet most powerful pieces of evidence ever uncovered. It tells us that compassion was not invented by modern civilization. It has been part of humanity almost from the very beginning. Perhaps empathy was never merely an emotion. Perhaps it was a survival strategy. A child who was cared for would eventually grow into a capable hunter. An elder who could no longer run with the group could still pass on invaluable experience. Someone who had made a costly mistake could prevent the entire community from repeating it in the future. In that way, knowledge did not die with individuals. It continued to live within the community. Very few animal species are capable of doing anything similar. Today, we call that culture. But in prehistoric times, culture was not simply cave paintings or ceremonial dances around a fire. Culture was an invisible toolkit that allowed an entire community to survive. It included how food was shared, how children were raised, how people recognized the migration patterns of animal herds, even how a community responded when one of its members died. Everything had to be learned. Everything had to be passed on. And each generation added just a little more knowledge than the one before. That is the extraordinary power of cultural evolution, a process that moves far faster than biological evolution ever could. Yet no matter how well people cooperated, one unavoidable reality remained. Everyone would eventually be injured. Everyone would eventually become sick. In a world without doctors, antibiotics, or hospitals, how did our ancestors survive wounds that might otherwise have meant certain death? Imagine you are out hunting. One careless step on a wet rock twists your ankle. A spear rebounds unexpectedly and slices deeply into your arm. An infected tooth leaves you unable to eat for days. Today, injuries like these are usually treated without much difficulty. But tens of thousands of years ago, they could easily become a death sentence. Not because the wounds themselves were always fatal, but because of infection. Even a tiny cut could become an open doorway for dangerous bacteria. There were no antibiotics, no sterile operating rooms, and no ambulances rushing to the rescue. Every single day after an injury became a battle between the human body and an invisible world of microorganisms. What is remarkable is how many people actually survived those battles. Archaeological evidence suggests that numerous ancient skeletons bear the unmistakable signs of completely healed fractures. Some individuals suffered broken femurs, a devastating injury that would have prevented them from hunting or gathering food for months. Yet their bones healed, and they continued living for many more years. That discovery carries enormous significance. Someone unable to hunt, unable to move independently, unable even to defend themselves. And yet, they lived. That could only have happened because an entire community cared for them. Someone brought them water. Someone shared food. Someone helped them move. Someone protected them while they rested. That was humanity's first form of medicine. Not medicine made from chemicals, but medicine made from care. Of course, that does not mean prehistoric people were completely helpless against disease. Current research indicates that many ancient communities learned to take advantage of plants with pain-relieving, anti-inflammatory, or wound-healing properties. Through countless generations of observation, they gradually discovered which leaves could be applied to cuts, which roots eased stomach pain, and which tree bark reduced fevers. They knew nothing about bacteria. They understood nothing about molecules. But they understood experience. If a particular plant once helped someone survive, it was remembered. If a treatment repeatedly failed, it was gradually abandoned. That was science in its earliest form, not written inside books, but preserved in the collective memory of the community. Perhaps the keepers of that knowledge were often the elders. They may no longer have been capable of hunting, but they knew when certain plants should be harvested. They knew how to treat bites. They knew when the entire group needed to move away from contaminated water. Sometimes their knowledge was more valuable than the physical strength of younger adults. Interestingly, prehistoric health was probably very different from what most people imagine. Our ancestors suffered more injuries and lived alongside far more parasites. Yet they were also less affected by many chronic diseases that plague modern societies, including obesity and illnesses associated with sedentary lifestyles. That does not necessarily mean they were healthier. It simply means their challenges were different. Every age has its own dangers, and human beings have always learned to adapt to them. Yet there was another kind of wound, one that left no mark on the bones, one that archaeologists could never excavate, one invisible to the naked eye: fear. In a world where every single day could be your last, How did people maintain enough hope to keep moving forward instead of being consumed by anxiety? Perhaps the answer lies deep inside the human mind. Try placing yourself in the shoes of a child living 50,000 years ago. You have never known a single day when life was completely safe. Every morning begins with the same unspoken question. Will everyone make it home tonight? A father may never return from the hunt. A violent storm may destroy the family's shelter. An unusually long winter may wipe out the food supply. A new predator may appear in a place the tribe once believed was safe. Uncertainty was not the exception. It was everyday life. So why didn't human beings become overwhelmed by fear? Why were they still able to raise children, explore unfamiliar lands, and continue believing in tomorrow? Cognitive scientists propose that the human brain did not evolve to eliminate fear. It evolved to use fear as a tool. If hearing a branch snap in the darkness did not make you anxious, your chances of survival would drop dramatically. If you failed to remember where a predator had attacked before, you were far more likely to repeat the same fatal mistake. In many ways, fear became the brain's earliest warning system. Yet living in a constant state of vigilance consumes enormous amounts of energy. Humans needed a way to find balance. That was when imagination began to play a remarkable role. Unlike most other animals, humans possess the extraordinary ability to imagine events that have not yet happened. We can picture the worst possible outcome before it occurs. We can imagine a failed hunt, visualize an escape route, predict where a predator may lie in ambush, prepare for winter while summer is still in full bloom. Today, these abilities seem perfectly ordinary. From an evolutionary perspective, however, they are astonishing. They allowed humans to live in the future more than any other species ever could. Current research indicates that the ability to mentally simulate different scenarios forms one of the foundations of human decision-making. The brain can test multiple possibilities without exposing the body to real danger, dramatically increasing the chances of making the right decision when it truly matters. That also explains why stories became so valuable. A tale about an encounter with a bear was never simply entertainment. It allowed everyone else to learn what should be avoided. A legend about a sacred valley may actually have served as a warning that the area frequently suffered landslides or lacked reliable water. A story about a courageous ancestor could inspire younger generations to believe that they, too, could overcome hardship. This is where science and culture begin to meet. What started as one person's memory gradually became the memory of an entire community. One individual's successes and failures no longer belonged only to them. They became lessons for everyone. And over thousands of years, those lessons accumulated. They became traditions. They became rituals. They became beliefs. Anthropologists propose that many prehistoric rituals were never purely spiritual. They also strengthened social bonds, reduced anxiety before dangerous events, and gave every member of the community the reassuring feeling that they were never facing the world alone. Today, we call this social psychology. Long before scientific terminology ever existed, our ancestors were already applying these principles, without realizing it, in order to survive. That naturally leads to an even deeper question. Did humans merely adapt to their environment? Or did we eventually learn to reshape the environment itself? For most of life's history, every animal species followed the same fundamental rule. When the environment changed, they had to change with it. When the climate became colder, thicker fur gradually evolved over countless generations. When food disappeared, species either migrated or slowly became extinct. Biological evolution always requires immense amounts of time. Humans, however, eventually took a different path. Instead of waiting for our bodies to change, we learned to change the world around us. It was one of the most extraordinary turning points in natural history. Current research indicates that the greatest advantage of Homo sapiens was neither superior muscles nor simply a larger brain. It was the ability to adapt through culture. Whenever one generation discovered a better solution, that solution no longer had to wait thousands of years to become instinct. It could be passed to the next generation almost immediately through observation, learning, and communication. Think about something as simple as a spear. At first, it may have been nothing more than a sharpened branch. Later, someone discovered that attaching a sharp stone tip made it far more effective. Another person learned how to fasten that stone using animal sinew. Generations later, the spear became lighter, better balanced, and dramatically more accurate. No single individual invented the entire weapon. Each person contributed only one small improvement, yet over thousands of years, those tiny innovations accumulated into increasingly sophisticated tools. That is cultural evolution, a process far faster than genetic evolution itself. Exactly the same process occurred with clothing, with shelters, with fire-making techniques, with hunting strategies, with food preservation, and even with the way children were raised. Humans did not need to evolve thicker fur to survive freezing climates. They learned how to make clothing. They did not need to evolve sharper claws. They built tools. They did not need to outrun antelopes. They learned how to plan. That is the fundamental difference between adapting through biology and adapting through knowledge. Anthropologists propose that it was this ability to accumulate knowledge across countless generations that ensured every child entered the world with far more than their own instincts. They inherited thousands of years of experience before making a single discovery of their own. In a sense, every human being is born with a second brain, not inside the skull, but within the community, within collective memory, within language, within stories, within the countless skills passed from parents to children. That is what makes our species truly unique. A beaver can build an extraordinary dam. Yet the dam it builds today is remarkably similar to the ones its ancestors built thousands of years ago. A bird still constructs its nest much the same way its ancestors always have. Humans are different. Every generation has the ability to improve upon what it inherits. We do not simply learn. We accumulate. And it is that accumulation which transformed the destiny of our species. Eventually, our ancestors no longer merely reacted to the world around them. They began to shape it. They deliberately burned grasslands to attract grazing animals. They chose where to settle based on generations of accumulated experience. They created specialized tools suited to different environments. They adapted their strategies whenever the climate changed. Rather than attempting to overpower nature through brute force, they learned to understand nature's patterns and turn those patterns into advantages. This was never a victory over nature. It was a partnership with nature. Perhaps that is the greatest secret behind humanity's extraordinary survival. Not because we are the strongest, but because we learn the fastest. Yet that leads to one final question. After hundreds of thousands of years spent struggling to survive, what is the greatest legacy our prehistoric ancestors truly left behind? If you could travel back in time and meet a group of people who lived tens of thousands of years ago, the thing that would probably surprise you most would not be how different they were from us. It would be how astonishingly similar they were. They knew fear. They loved their families. They hoped tomorrow would be better than today. They struggled to protect their children, care for their elders, and search for meaning in an uncertain world. The greatest difference between them and us was simply circumstance. Today, we struggle with bills, careers, social pressure, and technology. They struggled with winter, predators, hunger, and darkness. Yet the very brain helping you make decisions every day is the same brain that was shaped through hundreds of thousands of years of survival by those ancient people. Every skill you rely on today, from planning and cooperation to learning and storytelling, is part of a legacy passed down by countless generations of ancestors who overcame challenges that must have seemed impossible. That is why the story of prehistoric humans is not merely a story about the past. It is also the story of us. Because in one way or another, every time you solve a problem, help another person, or learn something new, you are continuing the journey that your ancestors began hundreds of thousands of years ago. And perhaps the greatest secret behind humanity's survival was never physical strength. It was our ability to learn together, adapt together, and pass what we know on to the next generation. If you found the survival journey of our prehistoric ancestors fascinating, let me know in the comments. In your opinion, which skill was the single most important factor that helped humans survive the prehistoric world? Fire? Cooperation? Intelligence? Or something entirely different? Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming documentaries, where we'll continue exploring the hidden stories of history, anthropology, and the extraordinary journey of human evolution. And if you'd like to continue this journey right now, simply click on the video appearing on your screen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.